What's happening? It's your boy Science for the Conscious Mind, man. Check it. So now, since we understand history, I think we understand history to the T, we can go ahead and transition and start understanding these treaties and how these treaties get hijacked. Science for the Conscious Mind. Let's get into some shit. So, because of our extensive research diving into beyond red and black, African and Native relations in colonial Latin America, and blackness in Latin America in the Caribbeans, and we understand Ladino, Sephardic, Moor, right? El Negro, the African, because we also understand during colonial times there was no continent called Africa. Like I was saying, in colonial times there was no continent called Africa. The word Africa, however, originated in the late 17th century. It was initially used to refer only to the northern part of this continent. So this is Africa in colonial times. So when you talk about an African slave trade, you're talking about this in the Roman Providence, right? All the way up to the Iberia in this northern part, and even this continent called Africa, right? These are your Africans in the African slave trade. Now, these Africans was wrongfully called Africans by Rome, right? Once you understand that the word Africa or African is Greek and Roman, right? So they was wrongfully called Africans, right? These were Sephardic Jews and Moors. Peep gang, let's get back into it though. So now, once you understand, when they try to do the whole narrative of, black Americans, 25% European, you indoctrinately think European means white because that's the narrative they want. But actually, that 25 to 40% is actually more Sephardic Ladino lineage, because these are your Europeans, right? Who are they? Dark-skinned Iberian, Moors, Berbers, Mandi, Fulani, etc., and Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492. Why is this important? They were enslaved, transported, or migrated to the Americas, especially Caribbean and Mexico, before the mass West African trade exploded. The mass West African trade exploded. Remember, we in colonial times, there is no West Africa as a continent, but West Africa as the country. Peep gang, Sephardics and Moors. So now, bring you up to speed. Now you understand who the Sephardic Moor Ladino is, right? African. We already know our American Indian ancestor. So when the Sephardic and the Moor, look how dark he is, have a baby with an American Indian, the baby becomes Afro-Indigenous. Why is this important? Because now we're about to get into the treaties. Watch this. So let's get into the Louisiana Purchase for one. All right, the United States purchased Louisiana from France and Spain, right? We already know that, right? But the problem with this treaty, right? The problem with this treaty is that this is during a time where a specific group of people was reclassified to Negro. They reclassified you from Negro to take you off the land so they can purchase the land. What am I talking about? Let's get into it. So let's break down why it was imperative for them to reclassify you. So the Louisiana Purchase and legal reclassification. When the United States bought the Louisiana territory from France in 1803, they didn't just acquire land, they also acquired the people already on it. Listen, those people include indigenous nations, Afro-Indigenous, Latinos, and Creoles, Sephardic and Moorish descent. Under French and Spain rule, many of these people had legal recognition, aka free people of color, Latinos, mestizo status in tribal treaties. But once the U.S. took over, they began reclassifying everyone under Anglo-American racial laws. So Indians, who were only federally recognized tribes with the treaties, and everyone else, even if they was indigenous, could be reclassified. And the same with the Latinos. So now, the free people of color, who are the Latinos, Sephardic, and Moors, they get folded into the Negro category, stripped of previous rights. The light-skinned Latinos and Creoles were allowed to pass as white only if they assimilated into Anglo-American culture. Peep gang. So, Because of the reclassification, treaties and legalese, treaty rights before the United States, France and Spain had treaties arranged with indigenous and Creole Latino groups, Sephardic Jews and Moors. When the U.S. took over, they often ignored or void these agreements. Reclassification equals erasures of rights. If your community was called Negro, you lost treaty rights and land rights. If your family was reclassified as white, you gained citizenship and land inheritance, peep game. If you stayed listed as Indian, you were forced into removal treaties, like the Trail of Tears, all because you got reclassified. Now, here's the key. All treaties is all connected. And because of the reclassification that happened to our ancestors, it starts setting off these wars, right? The Indian Wars, the Indian Rebellions, the Indian Revolts, the Gullah Geechee, the Seminole, the Haiti Revolution, and also the Barbary State Wars of 1801 to 1804 and 1815 to 1816. The Barbary states were a collection of North African states, many of which practiced state-supported piracy in order to extract tribute from weaker Atlantic powers, America. Morocco was an independent kingdom, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. Remember what Africa is at this time. I just showed it to you in colonial times, right? The continent didn't become named Africa until 1800s, late 1800s, right? So peep game. So the United States fought two separate wars with Tripoli and with the Algiers, although in other times it preferred to pay tribute obtaining to the release of captives held by the Barbary states. Now stop. We're going to go ahead and fast forward and break down what the Barbary piracy treaties are that was signed with Sephardic Jews, Moors in the United States. Peep game. But first, we got to understand how it ties back to Black Americans. Black Americans are Latinos and indigenous who were reclassified as Negroes. Because of that reclassification, treaty protections were stripped. Meanwhile, their white passing relatives got absorbed into the white legal categories and inherited property, while the darker relatives were enslaved, displaced, and denied rights. The legal erasure of Latinos and indigenous identity is why today many Black Americans can't prove their tribal ties on paper. The government deliberately wrote them out. This is why we're breaking down these treaties and laws. Since as Black Americans we are both Latinos and indigenous, we are double protected by treaty and internationally. All of this is happening domestically. This is why they mass incarcerate you. This is why police brutality is. This is why they do it to you. For one, you call yourself Negro, and that by your nations, right? So now when we get into the Barbary Wars and the Moors and the Barbary piracy treaties, right? The Barbary Wars of 1801 and 1805, 1815, 1816 were between the U.S. and the so-called Barbary states, Morocco, Algiers, and Tunis. These states were Moorish denominations ruled by the same people historically tied to the Moors, Latinos, and Sephardics. The Treaty of Peace and Friendship with Morocco in 1786, renewed later, that's key, was the first U.S. treaty with a non-European nation. That treaty recognized Moors as sovereign subjects with the rights, not slaves. How is this connected to Black Americans? Remember, as Black Americans, genealogically, we are connected to both Sephardic, Moors, and Indians, right? We are connected to Latinos and Indians, right? So legally connected to Black Americans, right? When the U.S. signed treaties with Morocco and other Moorish powers, it meant anyone of Moorish descent was not supposed to be enslaved under international law. But here's the trick. Once those same people, Latinos, Afro-Indigenous, and Moors, were living inside the United States, the government reclassified them as Negro or colored under domestic law. This is why the U.S. stopped calling them Moors in legal paper, because acknowledging them as Moors meant respecting treaty protections. The same reason why they stopped calling you Indian on paper is the same reason why they stopped calling you Moor on paper, because the U.S. government will have to acknowledge our protections and our rights. So we are still recognized internationally. Internationally, everybody know who we are. This is a domestic fight, and this is the same domestic fight that we've been fighting this whole time. but we've been fighting it under the wrong category as black.